Minister, on the 14th of March, Pierre Zakharowski, Irish-Ukrainian journalist, was murdered by Putin's murderous forces in his savage war on Ukraine. In the last week or so, we see Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian journalist who had spoken out fearlessly for 25 years, trying to get across the truth of what is being done to the Palestinian people by the apartheid state of Israel, executed in a premeditated murder. And then we have the utterly shameful scenes of Israeli forces, again in a premeditated attack, attacking the pallbearers at her funeral, the mourners, and by the way, something that hasn't been mentioned, raiding her house within a very short time after the word spread that she had been executed, raiding the deceased journalist's house to seize Palestinian flags show just beyond disrespect for the person that they had just executed. And journalists are murdered by brutal regimes because they want to hide the truth of the crimes that those regimes commit against people. The war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the oppression, the persecution of their enemies, and so on. To silence the truth, to silence criticism. 900 journalists killed between 2011 and 2020 worldwide, 50 last year. It's absolutely shameful. We must condemn it for what it is as criminal and hold to account those that carry out these crimes against people who are doing us all a service by trying to bring us the truth about war and about conflict and about the abuse of people by brutal regimes. But I have to ask, why the difference in response? And it is just so blatant. Because when war crimes are committed by Putin's regime, when journalists are murdered by Putin's regime, it elicits an instantaneous response from the European Union, the United States, and our government, demanding and imposing sanctions, cutting off trade links, arming those who resist the Putin invasion, doing everything they can, instantaneously and understandably, legitimately, saying this is not acceptable and we must act. But when a Palestinian journalist, who is the latest in a long line of Palestinian journalists, killed and wounded and injured and beaten by the apartheid rogue state of Israel, we get condemnation, but we do not get any action. Now I ask, is the life of a Palestinian journalist worth less than the life of journalists elsewhere? Is the right of Palestinian people to accountability for a regime that commits crimes against humanity, that commits war crimes against the Palestinian people, are the Palestinians any less deserving of accountability and justice and truth and a response from the international community? Our government, the European Union, the international community, they are not. But yet the difference is clear. Because despite all the condemnation, and yes, the government condemned Shireen's execution, yes, they condemned the barbaric scenes at her funeral. Barbaric scenes. But no response. You won't call it an apartheid regime. There's no talk of sanctions. And even though the condemnation has been quite strong, it is not anything like the sort of condemnation and then action that followed in terms of Putin's bloody regime. And it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that when the state that commits the war crimes, commits the murder, commits the execution, is an ally of members of the European Union or of the European Union and the United States, we take a different attitude. Somehow, the war crimes committed by our so-called allies, or the allies of our allies, if it's the United States or this European Union, are somehow less deserving of a response and the sanctions that should follow, the accountability that should follow for those crimes. It is plain to see that is the case. And one wouldn't even feel the need to underline that so much, except what they did to Shireen is just part of a systematic campaign of attacking journalists. There were 144 journalists wounded by Israel, Palestinian journalists, since 1992, beaten, shot, tear gassed, and so on. 19 journalists have been killed in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, if you want to call it that, since 1992. 16 of those killed have been Palestinians. During the Gaza assault by Israel last year, Israel targeted and destroyed the building containing Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. So this is a systematic campaign by the State of Israel to kill, execute, beat and silence journalists who are trying to expose the truth of the apartheid regime, and yet we refuse to impose sanctions. When are you going to impose sanctions on Israel for its murder of journalists and for its brutal war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Palestinian people?